Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sophos MDR ThreatCast. If you've been celebrating anything over the past month, I hope you had a wonderful time doing so. If you took any annual leave, I hope it was restorative and restful. As always, we've got a fantastic crew of people here to talk to you about a variety of things. What we thought we'd do this time around is, instead of doing just the kind of typical month in retrospect, we're going to do the whole of 2024. So you'll find there'll be another invite for the ThreatCast at the end of this month, last Wednesday of the month, as usual. So do go check that. Make sure you turn up for that. We'll then talk about January 2025. But this session, we're going to talk about 2024 and what's kind of been seen. So here today to talk is, of course, myself, Greg Eden, security strategist for Sophos MDR. We're also joined by Paul Jaramillo, who's the director, one of the directors of Sophos MDR, specifically for our threat hunt, threat intelligence team. We're also got Colin Cowie from Threat Intelligence, Pavlo Kulum from Threat Hunt, and we've also got Sean Gallagher from Threat Research, who's going to be taking us through a few things. In terms of what we're going to talk about, we're going to look at the threat landscape of 2024. With Paul, we're going to look at the observed threat activity across the whole year with Colin. And then, of course, Pavlo's going to take us through the whole sort of year in retrospective hunts. And Sean's going to look at the top stories over 2024. We'll then do Q&A at the end. But as always, we get this kind of question. If you have a question, anything you want to ask, it could be related to the content. It can just be about cybersecurity in general. You know, the session's for you. So if you go and look on the right, there should be a Q&A panel. Please feel free to use that. Fire any questions that you got. And what we'll do is we'll either answer them live as we go. I'll jump in with the presenter and ask them to take the question. We'll either answer the question behind the scenes through text, or we'll hold on to the question and bring it up at the end. Also, I'm sure we're going to get asked this another 10, 20 times, but it seems to be our most common question is, will a recording be made available? Yes, a recording will be made available, recording right now. The recording and the references will be uploaded to the MDR community roughly in the next 24 hours. So keep your eyes on the community page. You should get notification. And also, I think with our new platform, you can actually come back in and watch these sessions on demand. So you should be able to find the video in there. Right, that's enough of me talking. What we're going to do now is pass over to Paul Jaramillo, who's going to take us through 2024's threat landscape. Paul, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg, and welcome back from the holidays, everybody. So as you can imagine, at going over 2024, it was quite the banner year in terms of vulnerabilities. And so what we'd like to highlight first is something that tends to have an outsized impact on the ransomware incidents that we observe, which is exploitation of the edge. So it comes into play when you're talking about initial access. So threat actors are going to start with where they can initially get into the environment. And so what we've listed out here is 4 particular vendors that had quite a bit of exploitation in 2024. So you see Avanti with their edge appliances. So they have, I think, three or four different types of edge appliances that are added in here. The most notable was their cloud security appliance that was heavily targeted in 2024. And so the number in parentheses are the 8 vulnerabilities that were included in the CISA-KEV, which we'll go into in a future slide. And so this is not every single CVE, just the CVEs that were observed being exploited. After Avanti with 7 vulnerabilities, we have Palo Alto Networks, which is, a very popular firewall and VPN, followed by Cisco, another large vendor in the firewall VPN space. And then yet again, Fortinet, who has 4 KVE or 4 CVEs that were exploited in 2024. They've long kind of been at the top of the list, but here it looks like we've got 3 others ahead of them in 2024. So what would you do here? So I think a couple things that we would advise is monitoring for changes. So there's 2 CVEs that I've bolded there. So you see one under Avanti and one under Cisco. In the case of Avanti, this one actually didn't initially have a proof of concept, nor did it have a remote code injection aspect to it. That vulnerability was later upgraded in 2024, and hence we saw exploitation of it. So that's 2021. Now the Cisco one's even more interesting. If you look back, we're talking about a 10-year-old Cisco web VPN vulnerability that was scored I think a 4 with a CVSS score. And then all of a sudden in 2024, a decade later, we start seeing exploitation of it. So definitely need to be monitoring for changes. The reason we're highlighting CISA-KEV is we would advise giving higher weighting for vulnerabilities that have known exploitation. Seems like common sense, but as you'll see on our next slide, there's a lot of vulnerabilities to deal with. So KEV is one of the factors that we would advise incorporating, as well as make sure and include maybe an escalated process or a higher priority process for your high risk assets. So those would be anything exposed to the internet, either DMZ or edge devices, web servers, and then assets that house sensitive data. Those would be your high risk assets. So moving on, to give you a kind of a higher level view in terms of all the vulnerability activity in 2024, you're going to see your common ones here with Microsoft, Google, Oracle, Adobe, Apple. Those are all here, the greatest hits. What you'll see then, if you kind of look at it through a different lens, is that the KEV lens, or the CISA KEV, known exploited vulnerabilities. Microsoft really dwarfs everybody else, and that's simply because they just have so many products, and that the single vulnerability tends to be replicated in multiple products, so then hence you get more potential exploitation. So something to be advised about there. On the product side, I do want to mention that you do see the Linux kernel listed as number 1. However, that's kind of an artifact of the fact that different distros may have different CVEs attached for them. So while it may be just one vulnerability, it's replicated multiple times there. So that's something to be aware of. And then the last thing I'd like to call out is just the sheer amount of CVEs, 40,000 this year. So you can see in the bottom right, we're trending much, much higher. It's something where a lot of orgs are just, this is something that's just a heavy burden on them. And this year, we've actually introduced our managed risk service to help organizations. That includes a partnership with Tenable. So if you're interested in something like that to help lift that burden off of you and get your risk reduced, definitely reach out to your account manager. Moving on, so a little bit more guidance. So we talked about CISA KEV. We know Microsoft is number 1. Just the sheer numbers were up 38% year over year. An astounding 231 vulnerabilities came out with a 10.0. So that means, very easy to exploit when you get a 10.0 vulnerability typically. In a single month, we had over 5,000 CVs published. So just the volume of it is just off the charts. Now, I did want to point out something unique or interesting about CISA KEV. While we advise using CISA KEV, it shouldn't be your only tool in your kind of risk assessment methodology. So what we've seen here is that prior to publishing in the KEV, about 53% of those vulnerabilities already had publicly reported exploitation. So that's something to be advised of when you're using KEV, is that there's a higher bar to entry to get into CISA KEV. So they look for more higher confidence data. So it is a bit of a lagging indicator. So only 27% of the vulnerabilities showed up on CISA KEV without prior reporting. So it's definitely something to incorporate into your risk approach to patching, but also you need to add other tactics as well. And that's why I'd like to call out CWE, or common weakness enumeration. So if you look at that data, there's a publication about the top 25 most dangerous software weaknesses. And you'll see that there tends to be a grouping of vulnerability classes that have higher known exploitation. So they list out the KEVs next to them. So that will help you add additional confidence or priority onto yours. So please do go through this list, and we've linked that in the references, but you'll see that they tend to gravitate more towards code injection, memory injection, being able to write to memory. So that can help prioritize some of the vulnerabilities, whereas some of the CWEs show that there were no KEVs introduced at all. So that may help you focus on the ones that are a little bit more risky. So that's definitely some advice that we would offer up. Moving on, another area that we would like to highlight. So we initially highlighted edge devices as a main initial access vector for threat actors. Another very successful one for threat actors is also valid accounts. So what that means is that the threat actor, the first time we're seeing them in a target, they're logging in with a valid username and password. So CISA published their numbers. They're seeing that 41% of the time in their cases. Some earlier reporting from Google Mandiant reported nearly 40% of ransomware attacks begin with a valid credential. So that can be either they stole the credentials or they were able to guess them via brute force. That also means that they were able to either bypass MFA or they were able to take advantage of the lack of MFA. And so some of the pain points that I would mention here is you really need to make sure that all the accounts are enrolled in MFA and really limit the exclusions. We've seen a lot of reporting where either a demo account or service account was excluded from MFA. If you need to do that, a good best practice is to make sure it expires after a week or the work has been completed. But like I said, that's a very risky approach because the threat actors seem to be always able to find that one account that lacks MFA. Another aspect of MFA is that we tend to rely on SMS prompts, and that really hasn't been very foolproof. So it does work and probably is suitable for some lower risk services, but maybe just you don't have a lot of sensitive data. But what we've seen the last 2 years with a lot of scattered spider activity is they're able to co-opt or facilitate SIM swapping and basically intercept the SMS challenges. And so a better way around that is to use verification codes that also combats MFA fatigue, which is where a threat actor may hit somebody 3 or 4 times and then they just give up and hit approve just to get it to stop, and they're not thinking that this is the threat actor accessing their account. And also another piece of guidance would be for your very high risk systems, a physical YubiKey is a great solution as well that has to be inserted into your laptop or your workstation for access to be granted. And that will give you a much higher degree of protection for those high risk systems. And before wrapping up here in the kind of the threat landscape, we did want to cover some of the notable breaches. So there was a lot. And so what we've done here is tried to highlight some of the bigger ones. So the company I'd never honestly even heard of, National Public Data, and their parent company was Jericho Pictures, never really registered on my radar. However, they were a massive data broker. They had data from apparently over 170 million people across the US, the UK, and Canada. And this exposed obviously social security numbers. And the way that the threat actor was able to get in was default password reuse. Now, this is unconfirmed. The vendor or the business never came out and publicly stated this. This was reported by some media outlets, but you'll see the trend across all 3 of these that MFA could have potentially protected this. Ultimately, with this breach, their parent company was sued. There was confirmed identity theft, and the parent company filed for bankruptcy. Moving on, another interesting case was the Snowflake cloud breach. Now, this didn't happen because of a exploitation. What happened was this threat actor was able to essentially take advantage of the lack of MFA. So they were able to buy passwords or steal them themselves using info stealers and log straight in. And Snowflake, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of a log aggregator or data aggregator. So it's going to have a lot of data. And in the case of 2 of their customers, AT&T and Ticketmaster, there was actually 100 total, or quite a few customers. I think it was 165 was the final count that were impacted from this. But AT&T unfortunately had a lot of their location data from their cell phones and their call records involved in this. And then I think a very large one was Ticketmaster, 560 million customer records. The thing that was probably the most painful in this case, the threat actor actually printed out the tickets for about 39,000 people. So that essentially meant that they could have been stolen and they may have not been able to attend the event that they had bought tickets for. So what was the fallout? This was the largest breach when you combine all the customers of 2024, and the average payment from these companies was between $300,000 and $5 million. So pretty significant bad outcome for the people that were using Snowflake Cloud. Lastly, this definitely impacted me, and I think a lot of people in North America, was the Change Healthcare or United Healthcare data breach. This was the Black Cat ALF-V threat actor that conducted essentially a double extortion attack, where they not only stole the data and attempted to extort money out of Change Healthcare, but also encrypted their systems and knocked off their systems offline. This was also achieved via stolen password. 100 million people with their detailed PHI exposed. So this is probably one of the worst ones. It included prescriptions, diagnoses, treatment plans, a lot of very sensitive information that people don't want shared publicly. And then month-long service disruptions. They're tracking, I think the latest report was that up to $2.4 billion when they look at every aspect of dealing with this breach. So definitely a pretty sizable impact. And then another interesting anecdote from this case was that they ended up paying the $22 million ransom. That was considered kind of the end of Black Cat, because they stole the money from the actual affiliate that conducted the attack. Since then, they're believed to maybe have links to some other groups, but there was actually, the company never confirmed that the data was deleted. So in fact, they were asked for a second ransom demand after they paid the 22 million. So something to be aware of is threat actors, they're criminals. They don't always live up to their word. So definitely be careful there. And takeaways here from the Snowflake breach, SaaS is not secured by default just because it's SaaS and run by a credible company. A lot of times they'll make it easy for you to use, and so that may not be the most secure approach. Make sure MFA is applied uniformly. And I think it's a good idea to revisit all of your third-party data risk. So maybe you did some assessment when you initially onboarded that SaaS service. Please go ahead and repeat that regularly to see if the type of data that's in there has changed or your risk profile's changed. So that wraps up a lot of the landscape activity, and then Colin is going to cover the leak site analysis in more detail. So here you go.
Thanks, Paul, for covering those vulnerabilities and notable breaches. Let's take a graphical look at the landscape of data leak sites that are operated on the dark web and the Tor network. The main thing that I wanted to highlight here is at the very top, that second row, Ransom Hub. You can see them very consistent throughout the course of the year. And then towards the middle, you can see where Lockbit starts to have some problems around halfway through the year, and I'll touch more on that later. And on the right side, you can see the same graphic that demonstrates Ransom Hub as the #1 in terms of the pure volume throughout the entire course of 2024. But before I move on, I just wanted to reiterate the disclaimers. As you've probably heard in past ThreatCasts, not every post is a successful intrusions. Threat actors often will kind of fabricate their stats, and we have a belief that Lockbit is a little bit infamous for this kind of stat inflation padding that they've done in the past. Now that we've highlighted some of the landscape overall across the just pure volume of postings, let's take a look at what we've seen within Sophos, within our managed detection response service, as well as our incident response service in terms of the ransomware landscape. Here is a look at the distribution of ransomware by percentage of cases, sorted by the most common at the bottom and less common at the top. For ransomware families that had less than 5 cases, we bucket them all into a other category. You can see that this kind of other category at any given point of the year takes up at least 1/5 of the landscape. Sometimes we see threat actors use ransomware just once and then never again. I kind of theorize that part of that is to change branding and avoid being tracked by law enforcement or threat intelligence analysts like myself. But the other aspect of that is potentially testing out different ransomware, seeing what has operational success and maybe what gets prevented by tools like CryptoGuard. Now, if we take out that other category, which is that bottom 25% or so and take a look at the landscape, here is the distribution of cases where we observed ransomware throughout the entire 2024. One of the things to note is on the left side, that big dark blue section is Lockbit, and you can really visualize the fall of Lockbit throughout the year. And in case you missed some of our past ThreatCasts, there were definitely law enforcement actions against Lockbit aimed at disrupting them. Going into 2024, we assessed Lockbit as the biggest ransomware as a service program in terms of the number of different affiliates. And now that we're closing out 2024, we actually believe that Ransom Hub is the biggest ransomware as a service program in terms of just the pure number of different affiliates. And that's that kind of pink or purple color sliver that you see pop up there in Q3 and Q4. Other ones on this list that were consistent throughout the whole year, Akira, hopefully you've seen our reporting on that, as well as Fog ransomware. And if you haven't seen our past reporting on Akira or Fog, please do check out the show notes and check out news.sophos.com, where we've talked about some of the history of Akira ransomware. And then just before I move on to some other trends, just wanted to highlight the top half of the graph. There's some smaller players that we've seen throughout the year, like 8base, which is built off of Phobos. Phobos was recently in the news as some of the original developers were indicted, and it was a Russian national who is based out of South Korea. However, there are still different threat actors who are using Phobos derivatives like 8base or FOST. Taking a look at the top 5 ransomwares as it is today going into 2025, we currently believe that the number 5 or the top 5 ranking is number 1, Akira, number 2, Fog, 3, Ransom Hub, 4, Black Basta, and 5, Play. Just kind of go through the list and highlight some insights related to them. Akira has been around since 2023. Fog, on the other hand, just showed up halfway through this year. However, we've seen some threat actors active on both Akira and Fog, meaning in 1 month they deployed Akira, the next they deployed Fog, then back to Akira, then back to Fog. So not really clear exactly the full nature of that relationship, but there are definitely affiliates who have connections to both programs. Ransom Hub, as I talked about earlier, emerged in about February of this year and really started to gain traction throughout the summer. While there are definitely affiliates that have moved from Black Cat or Alpha V to Ransom Hub, it's not clear if that's a direct rebranding, but there's definitely some affiliates who previously were active on Black Cat that then moved to Ransom Hub when Black Cat shut down in February after that exit scam impacting that healthcare company. The last 2 on the list, Black Basta and Play ransomware, are both ransomware families that have been around for almost 3 years now, so the middle of 2022. We believe that these have a nexus to Russian-speaking cybercriminal groups. Specifically, Black Basta has some direct ties to the Conti crew, which was an infamous ransomware gang that was disrupted and shut down during the start of the Ukrainian-Russian war. And on the left side, you can see some of those trends visualized in terms of the spike of Ransom Hub in the middle of the year. And before I move on to the next slide, just wanted to highlight some of the smaller players that show up in our percentage of incidents, like Crytox. Crytox is interesting because they actually don't operate a data leak site. So while we share a lot of different trends related to the volume of data leak sites, it's important to know that there are some threat actors out there who try to maintain a smaller profile by employing direct communication to victims and not operating a data leak site. While ransomware trends are certainly interesting, let's talk about what happens before that ransomware is deployed. We use the term dual use agents to describe tools that can be used for facilitating remote access that are legitimate tools, but have capabilities that enable threat actors to perform intrusions. Throughout 2024, our top 5 dual use agents are AnyDesk, ConnectWise, which is a Screen Connect, if you haven't heard of it, Putty, OpenSSH, and Atera. Within Sophos Central, you can block any one of these tools. I certainly recommend going in there and setting up a policy. I wanted to really highlight that you can define policies based on users and groups, so you don't have to necessarily block these tools across the entire network. You can start with a smaller subset of systems and begin to build out a more verbose profile. And application control can be a really effective mechanism because we've seen time and time again that if threat actors don't have to deploy malware, generally they'll try to avoid it as it can be more noisy and lead to detection. So they try to abuse legitimate tools or living off the land to stay persistent in a victim environment. The final section of the observed threat activity for the year, I wanted to give an award to the campaign that was the most noticeable and impactful for us, and that's Stack 6451. This is a threat actor that we started investigating, impacting a handful of customers out of India in the beginning of the year. After identifying the campaign and starting to track them, we observed them impacting additional countries. At this point, we believe that they are very opportunistic in nature and they leverage automation. And if you haven't heard that term opportunistic, it means that they're not explicitly hunting down targets with a vengeance. They are scanning the internet for SQL servers, Microsoft SQL servers, attempting to brute force those. And then whenever they get success, they then try to leverage different dual use agents to establish network access, escalate to be in a more privileged position, and then ultimately deploy ransomware. Thankfully, in our cases, our Sophos product stack prevented ransomware from being deployed, but I did want to also highlight the dual use tools aspect here, which is shown on that right side of the attack flow. Specifically, there is a tool called Everything, Everything, which is for discovering file systems, which we've seen multiple different threat actors use for information discovery. Another one is called Defender Control. This is for tampering with AV. It doesn't really have much of an impact against Sophos, but we still see threat actors attempting to write it to disk anyways because they can be lazy. And then there's a couple other tools that we notice, like a system internal secure file deletion tool, which can be leveraged for legitimate IT purposes, but in this case was leveraged by the threat actors as a way to kind of clean up their tracks. And if you haven't read about this story, please check it out on news.sophos.com. And now I'll be passing the mic on to the threat hunting section.
Thank you so much, Colin, and hello, everyone. So for this session, we'd like to kind of go over the year in threat hunting, highlight some of the top hunts that we've worked on as a team, top hunting projects as well, which are kind of subsets or broader sets of hunts that kind of have the same encompassing theme and underlying logic behind them. And then we're going to take a look as well as some of the statistics in terms of our outputs and how our hunts actually resulted in additional activities being taken by either internal teams or otherwise passed on to the customers for their own external activation. So let's take a look at some of the statistics first. Over the last year, we've completed just under 200 of these threat hunting projects. Again, a project is can have one or more threat hunts associated with it. They will result in separate tracking tickets as well as multiple queries that are being used to complete these hunts with their own respective hypotheses. These 199 hunts also included 145 impacted customers and 313 systems belonging to those customers. So whenever we identify through our threat hunting customers or systems that are impacted by a specific threat activity, then those are passed on to our operations team, and then they will actually work with the customers and provide some additional investigative activities as well. So all of these were actually correlated and collaborated with the customers as well. In terms of the outputs, there's a couple of categories that we use to track what our hunts output into. Majority of them, I would say 127 resulted in new detections being created, net new detections or improvements to detections that we currently have. Then we also have a few instances where these cases are delegated and relegated to our operations team for further validation. So these are the cases that don't necessarily have confirmed customer impact, but we would still like to have the operations team kind of take a deeper dive and investigate some of the activities that maybe seem a little bit too suspicious and anomalous for comfort. And then we also have some that resulted in new hunting ideas, so they would kind of pivot off of the original idea, and then we would stand up a new threat hunting project and then kind of move on in a maybe separate direction that is loosely related to the original idea. We also have a category called none, which is basically just a catch-all category. These are the hunts that result in either validation of an existing detection or confirmation that existing detections actually do cover the threat hunting or the threat activity that we were hunting against, or we simply had instances where the threat hunt idea is valid. However, to actually realize it into a valid detection, you would have to do excessive amount of filtering, which would be counterproductive, and it would be narrowing down too much the scope of the actual hunt itself. So we decided not to actually proceed with a new detection. However, we always take inspirations from those kind of hunts and build out new hunts on top of that. In terms of the sources, a lot of the hunts came from either publications online or internal research that is being conducted by our own threat intelligence team, as well as our own testing laboratories, for example, that we use in the threat hunting team. Some of it will come from the publications from our partners. Also, if we do have internal threat research that yields the same results as the publications from our partners, we also want to share contribution there as well, because we want to ensure that the community grows as a whole. Some of them comes from news media. Those are the more kind of higher publicized types of hunts that we would use for our hunting ideas. Things like very severe CVEs that came out and exploitations of software that is being widely used, for example. And then some of it comes from social media publications like X, Twitter, Reddit, and things like that. And then in terms of the attack tactic, we track this through the MITRE framework. Now, the interesting part is generally execution, which is in red, would be the highest count for our hunts, or at least the hypotheses that fall into that bucket, because the execution is really anything to do with script executions, exploitations, executions of binaries, tools like lol bins, for example, being used in that initial stage of the attack, because that is generally the ones that we find the most activity in. And this kind of falls within that trend. However, in the past year, we've actually observed, as you can see, defense evasion taking #1 spot, which is interesting, as defense evasion entails trying to circumvent EDR and antivirus, and even some of the networking protection controls, which in this case, we've seen a spike in. So therefore, what we are observing as a result is a shift from the attackers trying to come up with novel ideas to execute their payloads, to actually coming up with novel ideas to evade detection to begin with. And this can be detection while they're on the system, or even detection when they actually initially drop onto the victim system. So an interesting statistic, something that we'll kind of keep an eye out on and see whether that falls, or at least it follows through in this year as well. But I guess we'll have to wait until the next summary meeting, where we can actually discuss some of the stats from this year. Now, moving on to the actual top hunts. So what we've done is we've picked out some of the top hunts for each of the months of the year. Some of them we may have already discussed in the previous ThreatCast meetings. Some of them are some more interesting novel hunts that we haven't had a chance to include, but we wanted to kind of still discuss. Some of them are honorable, mentions of hunts that are really on top in terms of both impact and our challenges that maybe they presented us, and that is something that we wanted to discuss as well. With each one of the hunts that we conduct, there are challenges and hurdles that we have to overcome. Some of those may be technological, some of them may be logical, some of them may be in terms of understanding the platform that we're trying to investigate. So we wanted to kind of highlight those as well. So for everybody in the audience who is either interested in how threat hunting process kind of goes through that life cycle, as well as if you are conducting your own internal threat hunts, something to kind of keep an eye out, and some of the lessons learned that we actually obtained as part of the going through this whole list. So we can start off with the January one. We had a set of actual Linux hunts. It was a Linux hunting project, and this was one of the hunts that was part of that project. We wanted to kind of focus on Linux as a platform, because we find that it doesn't get the attention that it deserves more often than not. In this case, we're looking at the nullified command history, which was a methodology used to kind of erase the command history that can be used in a terminal window, for example, to see what are the most recent commands that are being used, as well as being logged, because Linux does keep track of these commands. So this was an anti-forensics methodology that was being used in this case, and we wanted to see whether we can find interesting ways that the attackers are actually erasing the history of the commands being used as a means to kind of hide their tracks after the fact. So again, an interesting one, because Linux, like I mentioned, doesn't get a lot of love when it comes to threat hunting, but at the same time, it was a lot of great lessons learned in terms of how Linux handles command history, and we took some really nice inspirations in terms of like future hunts that we can work within that same space. Then we hit the ground running in February with the ConnectWise CVE. Again, the operations team kind of spun into action immediately when we first learned of this, and we wanted to ensure that our customers had the coverage, and we looked into the investigations that were specifically associated with this exploitation. In this case, the threat hunting team provided support by kind of enumerating what our environment looks like in terms of our customers, differentiating what a deployment on-prem looks like versus one that is maybe cloud hosted or all hosted by a different facility. We wanted to ensure that we have a good understanding in terms of how the exploit works for the on-prem deployment models as opposed to the other ones. And as a result, we wanted to ensure that we have the right data that is being passed on to that operations team so that they can actually take further action, and just kind of differentiating between anomalous and benign activities. Great lessons learned there, and there was a great collaborative project with our operations team. March looked into some of the registry hunts. Registry was a theme throughout the March and April months. In this case, we looked at two different hunts. The first one being the registry transaction logs, which talks about the registry changes and how those changes are being tracked by Windows systems. And the second one was around prefetch and how prefetch can be disabled through registry changes and registry key changes. So in both cases, the main challenges were to really understand how Windows handles both the transaction logs as well as the various and numerous keys that can be used and changed to disable prefetch. Prefetch, as you may know, kind of talks about what actions were taken by the system in terms of executions, and the transaction logs talks about the changes. So both of them are kind of identified both with the activities that were taking place on the system, as well as how the attackers may hide their tracks after the fact. So big theme in terms of the registry, understanding registry, big theme in terms of us as a team learning more about registry and how it can be used and abused. And really the idea here was thinking outside of the box and thinking of new and novel ways to actually manipulate registry keys, both through scripting languages and interpreters, as well as through using group policy, depending on the methods that the attackers are using in order to affect these types of changes. We focused a little bit on data exfil. DNS doesn't get a lot of attention when it comes to data exfil. More often than not, it's because it's very slow, cumbersome, and it takes really forever to send any sort of meaningful amount of data. That being said, it's still a method and something that we wanted to pay attention to because there wasn't a lot of coverage that we've noticed in terms of both publications and research. So that is something that we focused on that month, and we learned a lot about how DNS can be used to disassemble and assemble messages as part of the queries being sent to translate domain names. So an interesting one, and lots of learning done by our team as well in terms of the networking protocols and how DNS fits within that. June, of course, the big one. Operation Crimson Palace. We've talked about this a lot, and we had many publications on this, so I'm not going to go into detail in terms of what Crimson Palace was and what it meant. Just wanted to kind of highlight some of the high-level challenges that we've faced, because this was a massive project in terms of both research, operational response, threat intelligence, and threat hunting. Everybody was kind of huddled together on this, and it was a lot of people who were together. So one of the biggest challenges was to really ensure that we do this in the right way, and we collaborate in the right way, because this was a massive state-sponsored campaign. We wanted to ensure that this was done in a proper way in terms of how we're partnering with the customers as well. And some of the attributions that we've done as part of this research, we can use to backtrack and then find additional signs of potential threats within our environment that are not necessarily associated with this one specific customer. So again, coordination, a lot of research. One of the big hurdles was also obtaining old data for analysis because of the data retention policies that the customers may have. We had to kind of piece together puzzles without knowing the full picture, which, as you can imagine, is a very challenging thing to do. So a lot of data needed to be clustered, sifted through, bads from goods being separated, and then putting it all together into one coherent story was the biggest challenge, and one of the crowning achievements really of our team in terms of what we took place and what has happened during that month. So definitely kudos to everybody who was involved, and there was a lot of things that came out of this. We developed a lot of internal tooling that can be used to sift through large swaths of data, both in terms of sifting through it and then analyzing and then clustering into event clusters that we can then compare and contrast, A lot of good anomaly-based hunting was done as a result, and we've uncovered a lot of the different tooling as well that the attackers have used that we can then pivot into new detections and blocking measures through our agents as well. So lots of great work there, and a very very busy month, as you can imagine. Going into July, it was also a relatively large research piece around Darkgate Loader. Darkgate has been around for a while. However, Darkgate has also changed its methodologies and TTPs as a result, not on a fundamental level, but what we have observed through both our own internal research as well as the publications online is the fact that Darkgate was constantly shifting between different automation and scripting platforms as a means to exploit the systems that they're being dropped on. So as a result, we wanted to ensure, because we did have several detections already in place, behavioral detections, we wanted to ensure that we kind of had like a more of a mature catch-all detection that is going to be more effective than all of these ones individually. So a lot of that research took into consideration, how do we improve the detection that we already have? So we already had coverage, but we wanted to ensure that we actually really understand the threat, understand how Darkgate is changing its TTPs, and then also trying to improve the detection that we have into one kind of master detection. So as a result of that, there was a lot of good research being done, a lot of collaboration with the threat hunting team as well as the threat intelligence team, and then we actually ended up developing some new and improved detections as a result. So that was a good month to be part of the research team. August, we had another CVE, ESX Admin Group Edition. Again, in this case, there was it was because it was a two-pronged type attack. We wanted to ensure that we had full understanding of how these two phases correlate with one another. So there was a lot of anomaly-based and clustering hunting being done as a result. So luckily, we had Crimson Palace before. So what we could do and reuse a lot of those new tool sets and investigative and hunting techniques that we've learned from Crimson Palace into this specific research piece, and making it a lot more smoother and more efficient in terms of how we progress through the entire life cycle of the hunt and how we output these into relevant and effective detections. September kind of slowed down with we started taking a look into Outlook and Outlook C2. Again, another registry-based hunt, but one that kind of reinvigorated our desire to understand more about registry and registry changes and how they can be abused. In this case, it was abusing the web content, which is an old feature of Outlook, something that doesn't exist in the newest versions. However, we also know that a lot of enterprises and organizations across the world still use older or intermediately old versions of Outlook. So this was still a relevant hunt and something that we actually got a lot of publicity as a result. We had a lot of great questions about after the fact, after we presented this, about Outlook and how this can be mitigated. So it definitely had impact on a lot of the organizations, and we were one of the rare entities that actually reported on this and really did some in-depth hunting as a result. October came back with another CV. In this case, it was Veeam. Again, the challenge with Veeam was that the fact that there was multiple patching cycles, because it appears that the developers understood that there were multiple vulnerabilities, and then initial patches did not actually take into account all of them. So there was multiple iterations. So there was a lot of analysis between what was patched, what was not patched, kind of doing a diff between what is the current version, what is the patch version, and between that trying to understand what the attack vector could be so that we can actually devise a hypothesis behind our hunts and then execute on that. So again, the main takeaways here was really understanding how Veeam works, how the specific exploit works, and then moving on from there. November came with the Luma Stealer fake captcha. This was a lot of research being done because of the relatively new and novel technique of tricking users into pasting malicious PowerShell scripts. Multi-pronged attack with multiple phases. The scripts themselves had to be pieced together through various different methods. So there was a lot of reverse engineering of encoded commands and trying to understand how these fake captcha scripts actually worked and what are the different phases of the attack. So a lot of great research done and collaboration between both the operations team, threat intelligence, and threat hunting, and numerous new detections were being created, both the product detections as well as behavioral detections that kind of take a multi-pronged approach into detecting and blocking the activity as a result of this, because there was a lot of downstream activities as well that were taking place as a result. So a relatively large piece of research taking care of that specific month with some great results. And then kind of closing it out with December, which was a little bit of a more quieter month. I guess, the attackers also have to take some holiday breaks as well. In this case, we're looking at PPL Fault, which is the EDR evasion tool. In this case, it was a tool that is being used to trick the systems themselves into thinking that a specific execution of a binary is not being malicious, and then excluding it from the scanning tool, whether it's being done by an antivirus or an EDR solution or what have you. So in this case was just understanding how the tool works, its internal mechanics in terms of the input that it takes, and how it actually outputs the results of the actual execution. So in this case, there was a lot of research into LSAS, because LSAS was one of the core components of how this tool works. So a lot of great research in that, and that also gives us some motivations into the next year, looking into some additional and more evolved attack vectors, including LSAS. So that's more or less the year in summary. Lots of great hunting projects, lots of great results as well, and lots of great research taking place. So hopefully this coming year as well, or this year that we're in right now, is going to yield some similar results. So thank you all, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Sean, now.
Hey, this is Sean Gallagher from XOps. And once again, I am going to bring you a wrap up of the year's top threat research posts based on their traffic. Starting with number one, which was, do I have slide control? There we go. All right. The top traffic getting post for 2024 was the biggest early threat of the year. Back in February, you may remember, if you were tracking things, there was a pair of ConnectWise vulnerabilities. One of them was a CVSS score of 10, allowing attacks to be automated against organizations running ConnectWise. We saw a large continuous scripted set of attacks against this vulnerability. Some of them were tied to a Lockbit knockoff. They were using the leaked Lockbit 2.0 compiler. We saw those continue through through the beginning of the year, through much of the first quarter, and that led to a great deal of interest in that, since we had so many ransomware attacks tied to that particular vulnerability, and it was the first sort of level 10, score 10 CVE we had in 2024. Number two was a product of a long-term project here at Sophos, which we called Pacific Rim, about a 5-year campaign by China targeting our customers and using Sophos edge devices, using Sophos firewalls. There's actually a large number of articles about this particular campaign that are on news.sophos.com. But to summarize, if you haven't already seen these, there was a set of Chinese threat actors who we identified through threat hunting against large-scale attacks on our firewalls over the past 5 years, and were able to target them with patches we pushed out to the routers they were using, to their firewalls they were using, to track what they were doing and get information and insight into the 0 days they were developing. We shared that information and we collaborated in that with law enforcement in multiple countries. And since we published this article, the Department of Justice has issued indictments against the Chinese malware developers who we identified. Number three was an article we posted about Bootloader, in particular about a specific Bootloader attack targeting people in Australia. The MDR ops team picked up on this particular campaign. It was using a SEO poisoning, using search engine optimization, where very specific search terms were targeted to get the highest rank possible for a blog page or a fake fake discussion channel page that factored in this conversation topic to draw people to get a download, and that download was Bootloader. In this case, the search term was, "Are Bengal cats legal in Australia?" And we found that this is just one of many bootloader campaigns, search engine-based campaigns that we saw in the summer of this year. And while it was also based on a new variant of bootloader, we have also since then seen bootloader moving away from using SEO poisoning as their primary tactic and moving back towards using directed malicious emails with links to draw people to the pages that have bootloader download on them. Number 4 was an article we posted about a new EDR killer called EDR Shift Killer. This was a piece of malware that was being sold commercially on underground boards, underground marketplaces, specifically used to target endpoint protection systems to disable them to allow the deployment of ransomware. This was a bring your own vulnerable driver attack. So it was utilizing a known vulnerable driver that would not necessarily have been present on the victim systems. And it used that driver to load an attack that was used to attempt at the kernel level to disable the endpoint protection on the targeted systems. And then it was followed by ransomware attacks, generally speaking. We've tracked it being used by multiple threat actors. So it wasn't targeted, it wasn't associated with any specific ransomware. It was a commercial product in terms of being commercially available to malware developers and to ransomware gangs. However, in the case we identified it in, it was blocked by Sophos endpoint protection features, including tamper protection, and then when ransomware was attempted to be deployed, CryptoGuard protected against the ransomware from being deployed. And the final one in our top 5, last but certainly not least, was our report on Crimson Palace, the MDR case, where we've had a long-term tracking of a Chinese national state actor attack against a Southeast Asian government with 3 different clusters of activity that appear to be coordinated. And we did a great deal of research. The MDR team did a great deal of research into what was going on, where the threat was coming from, did time coordination analysis and things like that, discovered several new types of malware being deployed. This campaign, the first half lasted for up until August of 2024. We saw it resume in September of 24 after a brief lull, with one of the clusters that we had originally identified resuming activity and bringing new malware after we had kicked them out the first time. So we are bookending a bunch of this here with a lot of state actor related content. Obviously, that's not the sort of thing that affects most of our customers, but it is something we have been increasingly responding to. So I would recommend to get ideas of how to protect against these sorts of things, these levels of threats, reviewing the reports from this past year, specifically this one, and also for more information about the issues surrounding end-of-life devices that may be still on your network. The Pacific Rim series focuses in some part about the topic of digital detritus, as we call it, the having devices that have end of life that are still connected to your network that have vulnerable aspects to their operation, or vulnerabilities in their firmware, vulnerabilities in software that may have fallen off of your radar screen in terms of things you're monitoring in your installation, in your inventory, and those things are consistently used by multiple threat actors to gain initial access to organizations around the world. And that's it. That's what I've got.
Thanks, Sean. And I'm not muted, making sure I didn't make a mistake. All I can say is, Sean and the team put out incredible research, and a lot of it is either through collaborations with other parts of the Sophos org, like Pacific Rim, or if it's through like the MDR team or whatnot. So all I can say is, it's an amazing resource. Go check out news.sophos.com. Click the threat research button. There's an RSS feed button you can click, and if you're like me and still use RSS feeds because they're awesome and a great way to get content without all the other stuff that gets cycled up in algorithms on various social media networks, it's a really interesting resource resource, and it gives you an idea of the kind of things, the kind of minds that are behind it in Sophos. So do check it out. We're at Q&A, oh, sorry, Sean.
I was just going to add that as we've just scraped the top of the barrel here for this. There's a lot of deep research that happened this year, and I could not have done a lot of work we've published without the assistance of the MDR team, and we coordinate heavily between MDR and labs and other parts of the organization, and really that's why we've got XOps in the name of our group, because we're making it all happen between groups, across organizational operations. So please take a look at what we've published over the last year. Stay tuned for what we got coming. We've got a bunch of new research that just broke before the holiday, more coming. So thanks. I'm going to drop off and let you go to Q&A.
Nice, thanks, Sean. Given time, I want to keep us a bit succinct, so I'm going to rattle off some questions, at least the ones I think we should be sort of tackling. So I think to save my colleagues from jumping on, I think I'll try and tackle them best I can, and someone could step in and correct me if needed. So the first one was, we block, I'm going to paraphrase this, we block most RMM, albeit dual use agents, but we have some users, specifically admins, who need to use some of them and which we don't block. Is there a way to allow some admins to use the tools without letting the rest of our teams use them? So I think this is coming down to, when Colin was talking about dual use agents, things like, any kind of RMM tool or remote management tool, or even things like Putty, these are all kind of various tools that have legitimate uses, but of course threat actors use for malicious purposes. So there is in your Sophos Central accounts for endpoint, when you go into those policies, there's this thing called application control. A fun thing you can do with the policies in Central, like if you're aware of like how Microsoft policies work in their kind of various management tools, there is this way to sort of apply policies so that you can have the base policy, which applies to like everyone. And so you could, for instance, go into that and just block all these things that you don't need. But then you can create additional policies either for users or for groups of users or for devices or groups of devices, and have this special policy that has exemptions against your base policy. And so it means that if you've got like an admin or a system that needs to use one of these tools, you can go and allow it for that specific context while still having a really good, strong baseline where these things are blocked. And that's something I would highly recommend. Do go look through your policies and do some sanity checking. I often find when I used to do audits of central accounts, you'd find tons and tons of policies. It's always a good idea to go back and sanity check your policies, rethink your strategy, and make sure that you're making the most of all these different ways you can apply it to keep them simple. The fewer policies you have, the easier they are to audit on a regular basis, and so on. Another question, I think I'm going to skip the one about that one because I think it's a big deal. There was one that asked, why is there such a huge spike in CVEs this year? Did something happen? So yeah, I think when Paul was talking, you saw on the trend line, this year had a tremendous, almost like 10,000 more CVEs than last year. I don't think that's indicative that everything's riskier, but is that there's more eyes on the problem, right? There's probably not just having more eyes, so there's more vulnerability researchers out there looking for vulns and things, getting those things published and so on. There's bug bounty programs. More organizations are also engaging in bug bounty programs. More organizations are also engaging in CVE and actually getting their things published if they have a vuln and actually following the processes. More organizations have become numbering authorities themselves so that they can issue vulns for their own product stacks. So I think it's a good sign, not a sign that the world's getting riskier, but that everyone's paying more attention to taking security more securely. Also, as Paul's put in a comment in behind the scenes, and a good comment, Paul, he said that, and also as more software is being produced out there, things accelerated by AI or being accelerated also just by demand, that means that there's more vulns to be found because there's just more products out there. So yeah, really good comment. Another one was, why are hunts more focused on defense evasion and execution, but less so on things like collection and privilege escalation? So I think this is going back to Pavlo's section talking about hunts. You will see like the hunt team focus on things like defense evasion and execution as a primary thing because, evading defenses, evading security controls, evading detection mechanisms is a key thing to go looking for, right? That's where your products aren't going to capture or stop something. So that's why there has to be a focus. Things like privilege escalation and collection are important and they are still looking at them. But of course, privilege escalation is one of the steps that leads towards impact. And so you kind of work, I guess, from things like impact backwards and try and find those signals, or the juiciest signals, or the least problematic signals as possible, the ones that are going to be caused like the highest fidelity and so on. But yeah, and of course, execution is how a malicious payload is going to run. Hunting for those kind of things is really important, to looking for new techniques and so on before those things are pushed into products. Another one, and I think this is, I'm going to generalize this one as well, because this is, I think, a pretty important question. That someone's saying it that they still have to expose a single SQL server to the internet because they don't have a direct connection with a partner and they share some data but nothing sensitive. But what would you suggest we do? There's some more commentary around that. You know, the data's not. Yeah, the data's not sensitive, but also that the actual server is you know, they deem that as not being too risky. I think whenever you've got something you're exposing to the internet, especially if it's like a relationship either to like a cloud platform or to another partner or something, if you can tunnel that over a VPN or something like that, that's so much better. So instead of just exposing something to the internet when you're only really trying to communicate with one recipient, right? It's better to just go and set up a VPN access, set up like a segregated little network that, you know, even do like VLANing and so on, where you can actually set, this is now the only set of the network where these things will communicate with, so they can't reach your wider network. But that by having a tunnel, it means all you're exposing to the internet is a VPN tunnel. Those things are, in general, given that they're so important and good security products, get a lot of scrutiny, you know, versus if you've got a SQL server, especially if you're not keeping it up to date, you know, those vulns become, you know, easy to exploit and quickly exploited. Whereas like VPNs in general, I don't think we often see things that could be truly exploited. That's not always true. But yeah, again, tunneling is always better. If you want to set up like a secure way to communicate, that's always better than just exposing something to the internet. I think that's, and Paul actually gave a comment I want to make sure that's talked about. He talked back on the whole thing about why things like collection answers, a higher focus is defense, evasion, execution. Paul said they also tend to have blocks for collection. So we already have detections in place for things like collection or privilege escalation, but less so on new novel defense evasions, hence why that becomes an area of focus. So yeah, great comment, Paul, and thanks for adding that to the chat. That was behind the scenes. All right, look, we're at time. I just want to say thank you so much for turning up. You can find our weekly kind of threat brief that we put out. So if you go to the Sophos community, you will find in the MDR section, in the announcement section, we put out a weekly threat brief. You can find a QR code to take you there. You can also subscribe to get notifications when we post. This is where we do like weekly updates on what's been going on. And we'll often touch on things that we won't be able to bring up in the ThreatCast because there'll be more bigger stories that took place over the month. So do check that out and get subscribed. All the further readings here, all the links to everything that's been talked about. This will be posted to the community post along with this when this is all done. So don't panic. You don't need to screenshot that. But yeah, just a quick sort of thing to look at there. Otherwise, that's it. Thank you so much again for always paying attention, caring about cybersecurity, turning up and give us your time, you know, asking really good questions, and thank you if you've been attending over the past year. It means a lot to us that you're engaged, asking questions, trying to learn, trying to improve your security posture. You know, deploying an MDR service, we do as much as that we can, but of course it's a partnership. We work together. The more you can do to sort of shore up your posture, the better that we can then defend and look for those elusive signals. So look, I hope we'll be talking again at the end of this month. So we will be doing January ThreatCast as normal on the last Wednesday of the month. So please sign up for that. We'll be talking about January 2025. That was 2020. Let me start again. That was 2024 in a nutshell. Hopefully you found it interesting, and hopefully we'll see you at the end of the month. Thanks again. All right, you take care.